Okay, hi. Um, just as a note to myself, really more than anything else, but this is so far the only one of these videos that I've recorded on the laptop because the desktop got zapped by a lightning bolt here in the mountains of Puerto Rico a few days ago. So we're waiting for for it to come back from the hospital there. So this is on the little laptop. But anyway, that doesn't matter to you. Um, Today I want to talk about a couple of arguments from the philosopher Wittgenstein. These are arguments specifically that refer to Cartesian worries, various forms of skepticism. And for myself, I mean, in terms of being interested in Wittgenstein, trying to figure out what Wittgenstein is all about, because, Wittgenstein, people routinely say about Wittgenstein that he's one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, and yet it's conspicuous how few people really know why Wittgenstein is so important, or what it is exactly Wittgenstein said. As I say, for me, I think maybe I might even go so far as to say that the most exciting thing about Wittgenstein, one of his most amazing arguments anyway, is that it does seem to me that Wittgenstein actually makes some progress in overcoming some of these Cartesian skeptical worries that were first introduced to in Descartes' meditations in the 17th century, amazingly enough. And if he even makes even just a little bit of progress on that kind of picture, that, I mean, I think that alone would make him, blah, blah, one of the most important philosophers, blah, blah. So that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about a couple of his arguments that are responses to some of these Cartesian worries. And I want to do that in particular as the title of the show here, Wittgenstein on Solipsism. And so I want to talk about this word solipsism. I want to talk about what it traditionally means, what it means in philosophy. It's a very philosophical word, even when it's used colloquially or as a pejorative to say about someone, it really still is in its philosophical sense. So I'm going to talk about traditionally what we mean by the word solipsism, and I'm going to talk about then Wittgenstein's particular appropriation. He applies the word solipsism in a particular way. So that's what we're going to be on about here. Wittgenstein on solipsism. So what's not so much in the way? That's also so much in the way. Oopsie. Okay. So first of all, the traditional Cartesian notion of solipsism, what we ordinarily understand by the word solipsism, what it means. So coming from Descartes, looking at the first bullet point there in the Meditations, remember Descartes says a very high standard of proof. I mean, one of the things that David Hume's going to point out, if he's sort of responding to Descartes, is he's going to say, look, you have the standard of proof, a mathematician standard. The proof is demonstrating the logical necessity of the proposition, and that's just an absurdly high standard of proof. But I'll just flag that for now, because we're going to talk about some other problems Descartes has that Wittgenstein gets at. So, so Wittgenstein then, with this very high standard of proof, says, look, you can't prove a lot of things. You don't know a lot of things. The way Descartes' framing things in the Meditation really is, what do I know about? And this, and we are going to end up with some discussion of this verb to know and what that's all about. Obviously, this is deep at the heart of epistemology where we are. So two of these classical Cartesian skeptical problems are the problem of the external world. Again, exactly what do I mean by the problem of the external world right now? I'm talking about the claim that allegedly you are unable to prove that you know that the external world exists. Okay, that's the version of the problem. You cannot prove that you know that the external world exists. That's the claim of the skeptic. And the other one is the problem of other minds. And that claim is, again, about justification. And it is that you cannot prove that other minds exist. You have no way of knowing that other minds exist. The arguments backing these claims, I mean, in the problem of the external world, I'm going to mention here the problem of the senses. And so there's a question there. Notice if a la Descartes, or at least a la the adjective Cartesian. I'm not sure that Descartes is actually the guiltiest person on this count, but on a representational theory of mind, if you have a representational theory of mind, then you automatically have the skeptical problem about the relationship between the mental representation and the world and the thing that's being represented. So that's so for one thing, notice right there, we've made some progress in understanding the problem of skepticism or skeptical worries. We can see that it really looks like these skeptical worries, for one thing, are premised on a representational theory of mind. So if we had some non-representational theory of mind, maybe we wouldn't find ourselves saddled with some of these skeptical worries. So that's something to think about right there. In any event, Descartes, sitting in his chamber in the countryside in the Meditations, is willing to confront these sort of troubling implications, although really his concern is technical. He wants to know what it is that he knows beyond doubt. That's what he's trying hard to think about and concentrate on. But he does see then that since he only really, according to him, has any kind of direct access to his own thoughts and feelings. In fact, notoriously, of course, Descartes thinks that the fact that he is a thinking thing, having experience, is really, in one sense, the only thing that he knows at all, which is really just solipsism turned inside out, because solipsism is the view that one is the only mind. That is, if I took seriously that I didn't have, according to these Cartesian worries, proper warrant for asserting that I believed that other minds existed, and I took that seriously, I guess taking that seriously would be maybe starting to doubt that other minds existed, that I was the only mind that existed. There is, unfortunately, a mental health syndrome where people, for example, come to find their loved ones to be automatons, and I'm sure that's really horrible. But ordinarily, nobody thinks that. I mean, this is what philosophical skepticism is about. The skeptic is telling you that you don't know something that you're absolutely certain that you do know, such as that you're not dreaming, or that you have a body, or in this case, that other minds exist. And then the last bullet point to finish up on that, I mean, people will say, well, then what, what's up with skepticism? I think that skeptical worries, if you want, if you think they're a little far out and you don't like to, and suspending disbelief, I'm not even sure how the phrase suspending disbelief works in a discussion of skepticism, but in any event, if you want to bring it a little more down to earth, you can think about skeptical arguments and discussing the skeptical arguments as sort of looking around at our standards of knowledge and trying to figure out what's gone wrong. I think from the standpoint of somebody like David Hume, really the problem is not, the problem is with Descartes' notion of what certainty is, not with what we're reasonably certain. So in any event, moving on. So just to sum up the slide, that the classical canonical notion of solipsism is the view that I am the only mind that exists. That's, again, I have to say I'm the only mind that exists if I'm going to uphold the solipsist position. Because on that position, there are no other minds but my own. So Wittgenstein, then. Wittgenstein's going to take a leap. He's going to take a crack at this problem of other minds and this problem about knowledge of the external world. One of the things that's referred to sometimes as global skepticism. So in any event, Wittgenstein, just really basic introduction to him, very typical early 20th century philosopher, in as much as he thinks that a lot of traditional problems are pseudo problems. For example, Wittgenstein would point out that our grammar evolved to deal with, the grammar of our language deals with three-dimensional objects in three-dimensional space. We were hunting mastodons or something. And so then when we try to think about the mind, we think about spaces and inner space with stuff in it. And Wittgenstein, then one thing Wittgenstein would do was just point out to us that that was obviously figurative language, but we internalize the language and forget that that's figurative language, and we start to take it too literally. So that's just another example of sort of Wittgenstein's approach to looking at psychological concepts and trying to sort of see where maybe the grammar or the logic of it has led us to think there's a problem when there isn't really a problem. He doesn't think that about everything. He's actually very spiritual and all that kind of stuff. But this is his method when he really bears down on a philosophical problem like he does on Cartesian skepticism. Like other empiricists, like David Hume, for example, he's going to have some sort of criteria for meaningfulness, where he's going to say at some point you're saying something and what you're saying might be significant or beautiful, but strictly speaking, it's not meaningful. And Wittgenstein is going to attach meaning to getting something done in the world. We'll talk about that more in just a second here. Second bullet point. So in that sense, as to sort of metaphysical ideas, or in this case, these skeptical worries that come from the 17th century, Wittgenstein is like Hume, like Kant. Kant's very much in play in this discussion, I think, like positivists like A.J. Ayer and the language philosophers of Wittgenstein's own time. He's thinking that we're sort of going to do away with traditional metaphysics altogether, the philosophy, the speculative philosophy of the theists, that old thing. And the spirit here with Wittgenstein is empiricist. All right, so Wittgenstein does bear down for a long, long time, all the way from when he's working on the Tractatus and the early part of his about 20-year-long thinking career to all the way to the end. I'm going to explain two of his arguments. I take these to be two of the central, if not the two central arguments as to Cartesian skepticism and problem of other minds. I will call them the common world argument and the criteria of use argument. Those are my names for them. I will also point out that the common world argument about solipsism, when he first uses his special sense of the word solipsism, is found at the end of the Tractatus. It's a famous passage at the end of the Tractatus, right before the last passage, but it is quite consistent with the philosophical investigations. And I mention that because, of course, a big part of the Wittgenstein cottage industry is talking about the differences between the early Tractatus and the late Tractatus. And then people will take sides and say the one is good and the other is bollocks and all the rest of that stuff. But the fact of the matter is Wittgenstein uses this thought about what solipsism means in the same way consistently across both the Tractatus and the PI. And I invite you to look at that for yourself. So these will be what I will call the common world argument. And then the criteria of use argument, which, as the name implies, is about functional role semantics. If that sounds fancy, I'll explain that as clearly as I can in a moment. And that is more about the later Wittgenstein, the philosophical investigations, just for people who are keeping score. That is that second argument. The criteria of use argument will have to do with functional role semantics. So first, this common world argument. The last video that I did just a couple days ago is called the common world. And so obviously these are basically on the same topic. So I sort of amplified just this notion of the common world in that video. Another video in the series you might want to look at is Berkeley's strange empiricism. Anyway, the common world argument. Wittgenstein, first bullet point, like Hume and Kant before him, emphasizes the concept of experience. So we have this notion of you have experience of the world is necessarily by definition. What do we mean by experience? You know, what's the concept of experience? A concept that recognizes, let's not, let me break it down, the particularity of a concrete being. That is my experience, your experience, the dog's experience. Okay, so there is a particularity. That is, why is that? Because there is a particular body, and that is a particular living body living through its life. And it is at this moment doing that. And that involves having experiences. And in a sense, then you can say that the experience is the life. That is, I think we can all see the sense in which your lived experience just is identical to your actual life. So the claim here, first bullet point still, is the world can't be experienced from an uncentered, disembodied perspective. There is no such perspective. So second bullet point, and again, I want to always give props to Kant and also Hume for seeing this. I think Berkeley understands this. So second bullet point, compare these two propositions. The first one is this. The world is the way it is, independently of the qualities of any subjective experience. The world is the way it is, regardless of what anybody says about it. The world is the way it is, independently of the qualities of any subjective experience. The taste of the spaghetti sauce for me, I guess. So you've got that. Now, I take that to be plainly true. That is, I take it to be whether I was ever born or not, or if I should die in the next minute, that this world, the world in which I emerged as a biological organism through the normal processes of things, that this world exists quite independently of my existence. So the world is the way it is, independently of the qualities of any subjective experience. Take it. There's a world that's independent of my mind. So compare that. Right, that's true. So compare that with this next proposition. There is some subjective experience of the world, which is the one true subjective experience. Or even make that more formal. There's some representation of the world, which is the one true representation. There is one linguistic object describing the world that is the one true linguistic object describing the world. Put it any way you want. You see, the misleading intuition is this. If I say, perhaps my senses are deceiving me, or perhaps everything's a dream. If I say something like that, or above all, perhaps my senses are deceiving me, or perhaps the external world doesn't exist, whatever that's even supposed to mean, then we have an intuition that knowing something or not knowing something has to do with having or failing to have a mental representation of something. Being vague or wrong about something also then will be qualities of the mental representation, true or false. I'm not true or false, but my mental representation might be, and so on. So then we think that what the skeptic is saying is that maybe somehow we could really see what the world is really like, but we don't, because all we're seeing is this illusion, which is our own sensory experience. That's just not the same thing at all as actually perceiving reality. Now, we've already seen the argument that there really isn't any such thing as perceiving reality other than some embodied being that's alive having experience. I mean, that looks to be just what perceiving reality sort of is. But it doesn't look like, in this case, as the skeptic implies, when the skeptic says that my senses might be deceiving me, I have the intuition that there might be some whole other sensory array that if only I weren't being deceived by my senses, I'd actually have this other sensory experience or somehow sensory-like quasi-sensory experience that, alas, I'm not having. But that's incoherent, right? I mean, so there are only these very specific and particular and contingent and contextual experiences. And none of them is the one right true experience. They are all just what they are. They're experiences which are what? They are what it is for that body to be in that environment. Meanwhile, what about this common world? You know, Hume said about Berkeley, he said, you might ask, well, but what about this common world that we all share? And Hume actually says, I don't have the place in here, that that I see the world, you see the world. If you talk about some other common world, you just don't know what that means. Or Hume would sort of say, when you say to the quote realist unquote, right? If you say, well, the table's here and it's really real, and pound on the table once or twice, it's that last and it's really real part that's just speculative. It's not adding anything to the plain fact that this is the experience that I'm having. So the common world isn't an experience. You don't have experiences of the common world. There are artifactual tokens of the common world, and that's really interesting. Science books, physics books, geology books, history books, and also the universal knowledge that we get from reading things like novels and poetry. And these are all linguistic, these are all human artifacts. They're human linguistic representational artifacts And if you want, you can call them the common world. They are representations of the common world. They're intersubjective. But these are books. And however we're moving that information around, images, and that's our artifactual, instrumental account of the common world that we use to cooperate with each other. Okay, so, and by the way, let me also flag here, I don't want to go on about it much. I go on about it much in some other videos. This is also similar to some Buddhist ideas, notably Mahayana Buddhist ideas. My experience is not in the world. Also, the Shobogenzo of Zen Buddhism, Dogen, has this idea. So, first bullet point: Wittgenstein appropriates the word solipsism in the Tractatus to refer to this. This is the idea that there's an identity. It's a trimurti, right? It's a three-way identity. The phenomenally experiencing self is identical to phenomenal experience, which is identical to the phenomenal. And again, this use is the one that's preserved in the much later philosophical investigations. Let me just drop out of this just to emphasize this a little bit. See, we have this idea, and again, notice it's a kind of, this is what Berkeley was on. We have this polarity between the mental and the physical, between the inner and the outer. And so Berkeley says, well, gee, you say that the only thing you're experiencing is this inner, so why don't you, and you don't have any knowledge of that outer. So why don't you just get rid of that outer? I mean, that's your problem. You're talking about something that apparently you can't know about. So let's just say everything's mental. If we just say everything's mental, then it goes away. Now think about also in the Buddhist sense of the description, I've never had this experience, but the description of the boundary between the self and the external world dropping away, this sort of boundaryless state. So again, it's a very similar idea to the one that Wittgenstein has here, and it's about experience. So okay, got it. So we think about experience as mental. I think experience as a word, how is the word adequate? Maybe it's not entirely adequate, the word experience, because we think about the word experience maybe more psychologically, maybe more mentally. Experience is some kind of mental thing. Experience is something that a mind has, or something like that, we might be thinking. But in this sense of the identity of myself with my experience and the identity of my world with my experience, and we see that myself and my world then both collapse into experience, because you see, the metaphysician wants to do one thing or the other. They want to take the mental and collapse it into the physical, like a proper materialist, like a proper modern materialist like me. You sort of tend to think everything's nature, and I'm not a dualist, don't do ghosts and goblins. So one, very standard position is you just take the mental and collapse it into the physical, and sometimes everything's physical. Or you can do it the other way. You can collapse the physical into the mental, which is also very popular, maybe more popular in terms of pop philosophy than the other way around, that everything is mental and everything is really in your mind. But the point is, the wisdom here, I think, is the realization that the mental and the physical collapse and disappear together. They collapse into experience together. It is not a collapsing of the mental into the physical. They both are collapsing into experience, which is why our sort of connotative sense of experience as psychological or subjective is maybe a little glitch here, because we want to use the word experience in a sort of other way. All right, life experience or something. So let's look at the second bullet point here. These are these quotations from the Tractatus. Again, I invite you to go to the philosophical investigations with this in mind. The world and life are one. That's what I've just been talking about. I am my world, the microcosm. Again, this is a Buddhist idea as well. If every person is a little universe, there's a universe of subjective experience. You're in the middle of it, and you can move around and go and explore it. When it came into existence, the moment that you came to consciousness, and the moment you lose consciousness for the last time, it goes poof, and it's gone. And that, notice, is a sense of kind of sanctity of life, intuition of a lot of Buddhist thought, right? there, the microcosm, as Wittgenstein calls it. The subject does not belong to the world, rather it is a limit of the world. I think people get, the limit of my language is the limit of my world. I think people get that backwards. They have this sort of Kantian sense of it, that what it's saying is that my language is the thing that defines what I can experience. But I think it's the other way around. I think it's my experience is what defines what I can sensibly talk about in language. I think that's the way that he means it. So the last one's the quotation there from the second bullet point. Solipsism, with its implications, when its implications are followed out strictly, coincides with pure realism. The self of solipsism shrinks to a point without extension. It's not there as an object in that world anymore, and there remains the reality coordinated with it. It is my experience. Traditional solipsism seemed like an insane reductio of the Cartesian worries, right? No sane person. It's only those crazy people that I mentioned who would possibly think that in fact they were the only mind that existed. But Wittgenstein repurposes solipsism, this is the last bullet point now, as a response to this metaphysical problem of phenomenal properties, right? The view from nowhere, Thomas Nagel, understands some of these problems, but what he wants is to locate consciousness in the world somehow. He thinks subjectivity is real, and therefore subjectivity has to be located in the world, but that's the basic mistake, I think. So I think that sort of project that we see in the view from nowhere is kind of doomed, although it's great work. So Wittgenstein says, phenomenal properties of consciousness. Well, consciousness, since my conscious experience is constitutive of the world, that is, there's a sense in which the world, my world, just is my conscious experience. So my consciousness experience is not located in that world. It's constitutive of that. So the criteria of use argument, as I say, this reflects Wittgenstein's later notion of functional role semantics, that meaning is use. Wittgenstein says meaning is use. The meaning of a term is what's accomplished by using it. Classical concepts of reference on this view are, in contrast, rather magical, and that somehow there's a magical relationship between the thing and the object, that it is the word and the object that it is denoting. And in this sense, notice that you don't need that relationship. William James also achieves this, by the way, in his pragmatist epistemology. That is, you don't need to appeal to any kind of mental representations or any other semantic properties such as truth values at all here. What you're talking about is what is actually accomplished by making those noises, by making that utterance. I think that's what really bums linguists out about Wittgenstein, but I think that's what's right about it. That is to say, second bullet point, these are pragmatic. They're not conventional. They're pragmatic criteria, and they delineate the meaningful use of the verb to know. That is, we don't get to make it up. We tend to think that language is a human artifact. Language is a human trait. That's not the same thing as saying it's an artifact. Language is something like clothing that imposes itself on humans, or something like that. Third bullet. So here's the sense of it. I ask you, do you know where your keys are? And when I ask you, do you know where your keys are, we can see why I might ask you, because I have some reason for wanting to know. Do you know where they are? And not only that, but I do know that you might know where they are, or you might not, or you might, oh, they're right here. Oh, no, they're not. You might be mistaken about where they are. And those, those are some of the criteria, right? I mean, it has to be the case. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any reason. There wouldn't be any informational value. There would be no pragmatic reason for me to ask you, do you know where they are? Unless it could be that you did or you did not. Right? The external world, though, fourth bullet point, as much as everything that we experience. In fact, we just said, remember, my experience of the external world sort of is the same thing as my life, is the same thing as me. The external world is everything we experience, is the context of knowledge. So it's not a possible object of knowledge itself. Again, props to Hume and to Kant, who both understood this very well, to great profit in both cases. Right, in everything that we experience as the external world, that there and therefore is the context of knowledge. What are the necessary conditions for the possibility of knowledge? So last bullet point, the correct answer to the skeptic, then, this is the way, see, skepticism, as Wittgenstein points out, or is it Hume? I really don't know, I'll have to check. One of them says this, that it's like a card trick. That is, the card trick is all set up. They fixed the deck before they even approached you and offered to show you the card trick. And then they went through the whole rigmarole. But the cards were fixed before it even started. How is that analogous to what the skeptic claims? When the skeptic claims that I don't know something that I'm certain that I do know. Well, what happens, as I mentioned in the case of Descartes' mathematical criteria of logical certainty, is that the criteria of knowledge is the standard of knowledge is just raised up to an unreasonable expectation just right at the beginning. I mean, because I don't have logical proof, as Hume points out, that the sun is going to rise in the east tomorrow morning. I don't have logical proof of just about anything at all. So when Descartes says, I don't know just about anything at all, well, yeah, that's not surprising. If you think that you don't know something, if you don't have logical proof of its logical necessity. So the correct answer to the skeptic is this. When the skeptic says, you can't prove that the external world exists, the answer is this. The answer is, I neither know or nor do I not know that the external world exists. The existence of the external world is just not a meaningful object of knowledge. It's not a case of knowledge. Which brings us then to the same argument, the criteria of use argument, as it applies to other minds. And I think I'm going to end with this. I think this is really the swiftest. I think this is funny. It's, but here's how it goes. So think about pain, for example. So you feel a pain now. Now, pre-reflectively, we might want to say, yes, I know I'm in pain. I know I'm in pain. How could I not know I'm in pain? And again, the pre-reflective thoughts going on. There's no way I couldn't know I'm in pain. After all, it's me and my pain. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The only one who does know that I'm in pain. Not only couldn't I not know. But let's think about this criteriological argument. That is, it has to be, what are coherent conditions for the use of the verb to know? I might know it or I might not know it. So it makes sense to know, do you know it? Or for me to assert, I know it. Yes, I do know it. And that all is something that verb and the use of that verb is coherent within certain conditions. Those conditions we're under, I may know it or I may not know it. The answer is, hey, you know what? I don't know that. But I guess if you say you don't know that, then you know what it would take to know it. And I might be mistaken. But in that sense, I don't know that I'm in pain. I don't know that I believe what I believe or that I'm feeling what I'm feeling. I just do believe and feel those things. It's not something that I could check. And it looks like being able to check whether it's right or not might be another condition on saying that I know it. But in any event, it's not the kind of thing that I might not know. That doesn't look like it makes any sense. So the upshot is, first bullet point, it makes no sense to say I know about my own thoughts and feelings. Again, my own thoughts and feelings are not proper objects of knowledge for me. They're just direct constituents of my experience. Not the kinds of things I might be mistaken about. But that doesn't mean I know them. That means it doesn't make any sense to say that I know them. Second bullet point, in the case of other people, though, they do obtain. How's she doing today? She's very much better than she was yesterday. Oh, how do you know that? Well, I just saw her an hour ago. Oh, okay. I wondered how she was doing and how she was feeling. And now I know because I asked. And someone else who had the information gave it to me. That is to say, I just routinely know or don't know about other people's thoughts and feelings. I mean, newsflash. And when it's important, I can take measures and ask questions and do investigations to try and find out what other people's thoughts and feelings are. Sometimes I know and sometimes I don't. And unfortunately, I'm frequently mistaken, but that's another story. So the upshot of that is, yes, the third bullet point, as I say, I think this is one of Wittgenstein's more sporting positions. Whether you like it or not, I mean, I think it's kind of a delightful outcome. I mean, according to Wittgenstein here, and I see what he means, it doesn't make sense to say that I know about my own thoughts and feelings. It only makes sense to say that I know about other people's thoughts and feelings. So not only is it not true that I don't know that other minds exist, actually, it's that I only know that other minds exist. It's not clear that I can state that I know that my mind exists. That's another thing to think about. Well, I say I know that my mind exists. Can I defend it? Is it demonstrable that I might know or not know that my mind exists? All right. Well, that's going on actually. So let's then look at these just to close up these two senses of solipsism, the canonical, what I'm calling Cartesian notion of solipsism, and then solipsism as Wittgenstein develops it in response to these Cartesian worries. Traditional Cartesian sense of solipsism is the mind alone in the universe. It's a challenge, right? Because they, well, that can't be true. So what's gone wrong? We have to figure out what's happening here. Because we can't prove those things. We can't prove that other minds exist, but if we can't prove that other minds exist, and especially if we can't prove the external world exists, then it really looks like that I might just be the only mind that exists. And yet a challenge, because nobody thinks that. It's a challenge motivated by the alleged impossibility of proving that other minds exist. But nobody, certainly not Descartes or Wittgenstein, ever thought they might actually be in that condition. Bertrand Russell tells us about a letter that he got from someone once that said that they were a solipsist and that they were surprised there weren't a lot more solipsists out there. So, all right, second bullet point. Wittgenstein's sense of solipsism is the mind's self-identity with conscious phenomenal experience. So what's Wittgenstein's sense of solipsism? That might not be as clear as I want it to be at this point. Wittgenstein's sense of solipsism, his use of the word solipsism is this, that it is true that I have this sort of life world, the world of my experiences, that is my phenomenal world. The world as I experience it as a living being living through my life. So in that sense, yes, solipsism, that phenomenal world is my world. As I said before, in reference to Buddhist ethics, for example, that's a whole universe that's going to disappear when my consciousness disappears, because that universe just is my consciousness. Experiencing consciousness is a universe. The universe is an experience in consciousness. Now that's a new idea, but I'm sure Nagarjuna would say that's true. Last bullet point, phenomenal properties then aren't a metaphysical problem, right? It's supposedly one of the big problems in metaphysics of mind, the problem of phenomenal properties. Doesn't look like they can be analyzed in terms of physical properties. But on this species of argument, they are not in that common world. They're not in that world that we describe in history books and physics books and novels. That's not the world in which individual experience lives. That's the common world. And the only way we experience that is through these linguistic artifacts. So anyway, expanding, as I say, I have now a number of videos on this topic, but this one specializing in Wittgenstein's use of that word solipsism. Two things that stand out for me. One is that there is this continuity, very strong continuity between these passages from Tractatus and arguments from the philosophical investigations. And the other thing, maybe more substantial, is that it does look to me, I know not everybody, these arguments aren't everyone's taste, but to me, these arguments look like they make substantial progress in massaging my skeptical worries, if I ever had them, about the problem of other minds or the problem of knowledge of the external world. I am persuaded those are pseudo problems. And I think that, as I mentioned at the beginning, if that's true, then that alone does give Wittgenstein some credit to being a world-class philosopher. All right, so I'll just end it with that. Thanks. Now we're going to see how this laptop video comes out. Okay, thanks. I'll see you.